Robert Taft spent much of his political life warning about power, warning about war, warning about emergency government, warning about the tendency of institutions to expand beyond their original limits. And yet, the greatest political battle of his life would not be against Democrats. It would not be against Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Truman. It would be fought inside his own party, because by the early 1950s, the Republican Party stood at a crossroads, and Robert Taft was about to discover that the future was moving in a very different direction. In the last episode, we explored Robert Taft's growing concerns about war, executive power, NATO, and the rise of what he feared would become a permanently mobilized national security state. We also saw how those concerns increasingly placed him at odds not only with Democrats, but with the future direction of his own party, because by the early 1950s, the Republican Party itself was changing. The old republicanism Taft had spent his life defending, constitutional restraint, congressional authority, skepticism toward foreign entanglements, was gradually giving way to something new, and sooner or later that conflict would have to be decided, because ideas eventually collide with reality, and in Taft's case, they collided with one of the most important presidential elections in modern American history, a contest that would determine not only the future of Robert Taft, but the future of the Republican Party itself. By the late 1940s, Robert Taft had become one of the most influential figures in American politics. He had spent decades in public life, mastered legislative detail, built deep relationships throughout Congress, and became the intellectual leader of conservative Republicans. There was a reason people called him Mr. Republican. Not because he was flashy, not because he was charismatic, but because he embodied a particular vision of what the Republican Party once was, a party of constitutional limits, fiscal restraint, congressional authority, and skepticism toward concentrated power. For many Republicans, Taft seemed the natural heir to the presidency, and by 1952, he was closer than ever before. But history had other plans, because another figure had emerged, a man whose reputation extended far beyond politics, Dwight Eisenhower, the commander of Allied forces in Europe, the architect of D-Day, one of the most admired men in America. Unlike Taft, Eisenhower was not primarily known as a political thinker. He was known as a leader, a war hero, a symbol of victory. And perhaps most importantly, he represented a different vision of America's future, a vision that accepted America's new global role, a vision more comfortable with alliances, international commitments, and long-term American leadership abroad. This made Eisenhower attractive not only to voters, but to many influential figures within the Republican establishment itself, particularly on the East Coast. For years, many of these Republicans had grown uneasy with Taft's brand of conservatism, his skepticism toward foreign entanglements, his criticism of NATO, his resistance to the emerging post-war consensus. They feared that Taft represented an older Republican tradition that no longer fit the world America now inhabited. So when Eisenhower entered the race, many establishment figures quickly rallied behind him, not because Eisenhower needed help becoming famous, his popularity was already enormous, but because he offered a path toward a different Republican future, one more aligned with the international responsibilities that many post-war leaders had come to accept. Nor did Eisenhower face the level of opposition from major newspapers and opinion makers that Taft often encountered. Indeed, much of the political and media establishment seemed far more comfortable with Eisenhower's vision of America's role in the world than with Taft's. This was not merely a contest between two men, it was a contest between two Republican traditions, two understandings of America's place in the world, and two different futures. The battle that followed was fierce. Delegates were contested, rules were disputed, Both sides believed the future of the party was at stake. For Taft, this was the culmination of decades of work, the moment he had spent much of his life approaching, and for a time, victory seemed possible, very possible. Yet, as the convention unfolded, the momentum increasingly shifted toward Eisenhower, the war hero, the national figure, the candidate who seemed capable of winning the general election. And when the votes were finally counted, Eisenhower prevailed. Taft had lost. Why? Part of the reason was political, part of it was historical, and part of it may simply have been personal. America in 1952 was not the America of 1920 or 1930. The country had passed through Depression, World War, and the beginning of the Cold War. Many voters now accepted a larger American role in global affairs. The mood of the nation had changed. But there was also something about Taft himself. He was extraordinarily intelligent, exceptionally disciplined, and deeply principled. Yet he often seemed more comfortable discussing institutions than performing politics, more comfortable explaining a policy than inspiring a crowd, more comfortable defending an idea than cultivating an image, and modern politics rarely rewards that combination. One of the things that struck me while reading this biography was how often Taft seemed almost indifferent to the rituals of political charm. There are stories throughout the book where he alienates important people unnecessarily, moments where he appears socially awkward, even uncomfortable. At one point, he reportedly began reading a newspaper after reporters had stopped asking questions, apparently unaware of how odd that looked. There were dinners where he refused to tell influential people what they wanted to hear, moments where a little diplomacy over rigid honesty might have helped him enormously. And yet, those same qualities are part of what make him feel more genuine, because he often seemed less interested in being liked than in being honest, less interested in performance than in substance, and while that may have hurt him politically, it is also one of the reasons he remains fascinating. What makes Taft's story so interesting is that in one sense he lost. He never became president. His faction lost control of the Republican Party, and the internationalist vision he opposed largely prevailed. But in another sense, the questions he raised never disappeared. Questions about executive power, questions about war, questions about military spending, questions about foreign intervention, questions about the balance between security and liberty. Generation after generation, Americans have continued asking many of the same questions Taft wrestled with, because history never fully resolved them, and perhaps today these questions feel as relevant as ever. After decades of military interventions, foreign commitments, and global responsibilities, many Americans have begun to ask whether the benefits have always justified the costs, whether the United States should continue to serve as the world's primary guarantor of international order, or whether the balance between national interest and global responsibility requires reconsideration. It is perhaps no accident that slogans such as "America First" continue to resonate, because beneath that slogan lies a question that Taft himself would have recognized. What obligations does a republic owe to the world, and what obligations does it owe to its own citizens first? After the convention, Taft did something many politicians struggle to do. He accepted defeat. He worked with Eisenhower. He remained influential, and eventually became Senate Majority Leader. In 1953, he had become the most influential Republican in Congress, a figure whose judgment carried enormous weight within both the Senate and the Eisenhower administration. Indeed, many contemporaries viewed him as indisposable. One political cartoon published after his death captured this feeling perfectly. It depicted the White House supported by great pillars, and one of those pillars had collapsed. Its name was Robert Taft. because by then many Republicans had become so accustomed to his leadership that they struggled to imagine how the party and even the administration would function without him. Ironically, just as Taft reached the height of his influence, his health began to fail. Cancer was rapidly advancing, and time was running short. After spending decades pursuing public service, Robert Taft had finally arrived at the peak of his career, only to discover he would not remain there for long. In July of 1953, at the age of 63, Robert Taft died. And perhaps this is where the real significance of Taft emerges, because political success is not always the same thing as historical significance. Many people achieve power. Far fewer leave behind questions worth remembering. Taft's legacy was not a presidency. It was not a sweeping political revolution. It was not even victory. His legacy was a set of concerns, a set of warnings, a set of questions. Questions that remain remarkably relevant. How much power should government possess? What should restrain it? How should free societies respond to fear? Can constitutional limits survive permanent crisis? And can republics remain republics while exercising global power? And perhaps this is one reason I found myself admiring Taft, not because I agreed with every position he held, and not because he was always consistent, particularly when confronted by the threat of communism, but because he approached politics with seriousness, with thoughtfulness, and with a genuine concern for long-term consequences. What struck me most was not any single policy position, it was his permanent concern with limits, the limits of power, the limits of government, and the limits that free societies place upon themselves in order to remain free. Again and again, Taft returned to a question that feels remarkably relevant today. What happens when war, fear, and crisis become permanent features of political life? Because Taft believed that foreign policy and domestic liberty were not separate questions, that military commitments abroad could reshape institutions at home, that emergency powers have a tendency to outlive emergencies, and that republics must constantly guard against the gradual concentration of authority. Whether one agrees with him or not, those concerns seem difficult to dismiss, especially after a century marked by world wars, Cold War mobilization, foreign interventions, and expanding executive power. He seemed less interested in winning arguments than in understanding institutions, less interested in slogans than in principles and preserving liberty in our country. And in an age where politics often rewards certainty, performance, and outrage, that seriousness feels surprisingly rare. What makes Robert Taft memorable is not that he rejected power entirely, nor that he offered easy answers. It is that he never stopped asking difficult questions, questions that remained unpopular, questions that often cost him politically, questions that many people preferred not to hear, because Taft understood something that modern politics often forgets, that the greatest political questions are rarely solved permanently. They return, generation after generation, under different circumstances, in different forms. But asking many of the same things, how much power should government possess? What should restrain it? How should free societies balance security and liberty? What obligations does a republic owe to the world? And what obligations does it owe to its citizens first? Taft never found final answers to those questions. Perhaps no one can. But he took them seriously, and that seriousness may be part of his most important legacy. Robert Taft never became president. He lost the greatest political battle of his life, and the Republican Party ultimately moved in a direction he spent decades warning against. Yet his importance was never dependent upon victory, because some political figures are remembered for the offices they held. Others are remembered for the questions they leave behind. Robert Taft belongs to the second category. He did not leave behind a political dynasty. He left behind a warning. Whether that warning was wise or mistaken is for each generation to decide. but it remains one of the most important questions in American political history. I'll see you in the next video.